Hey, I'm Charlie Thompson, and these are the lecture slides for the chapter on urban geography. So in this chapter, we're going to look at why do cities exist? What are the factors that determine where a city gets located? What are the main city layouts? And how do cities change over time? Those are the main questions we're going to be looking at in this chapter. So some things about urban geography. Most people, for the first time ever, live in cities. More people live in cities than not cities. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. For the first time in human history, the majority of humans on the planet live in some sort of urban situation. Where cities are often offer important clues in the function of cities, so we can figure out what functions cities perform based on where they get located. The layout of cities also reveal clues as to how they function. And cities have a life cycle, or maybe neighborhoods is a better way of thinking of that. Neighborhoods within cities have a life cycle. Cities have a life cycle. And finally, people form strong attachments to cities. They get a sense of place and identify with that city. New York, I think, is probably the best example of that. So why do people live in cities? Well, convenience, because cities are so dense, a great many amenities are available. Shopping, services, professional services, business services, all those things are located within a relatively small area in a city, again, because they're so dense. Economies of agglomeration refers to the advantage of having multiple services clustered close together, and that agglomeration or grouping of other services then can reduce the friction of distance because the distance itself is reduced. Since all your services are in one relatively small area, the effects of distance are minimized. Cities provide economies of scale. There are some things that become more economical as they get larger, as they ramp up in scale. And so we see those are another reason, the economies of scale. It's going to be a positive feedback loop that cities, once they get big enough, can attract certain services that can take advantage of economies of agglomeration and economies of scale, which then provides more attraction, and so the city grows. What is a city? How do you define a city? What's the difference between a city and a village and a town? Well, some of those, there's metropolises. Those are cities. Megalopolis, those are larger than metropolis. Mega, big. So really, really big cities like Los Angeles and Tokyo and Mexico City and Mumbai. The multi-million population cities, or maybe even cities that are measured in the tens of millions. Cities are incorporated. That's one of the defining features of a city. Going back to the chapter on politics, one of the ways of thinking this is autarky, that cities have a city charter and they have a defined city limit and they have authority over some of the functions, some of the things that happen inside those city limits. There is a definition of size, maybe 2,500 people. Once you get 2,500 people, you can consider a town to be urban. Population density is another way of looking at a city, not just the size. I mean, because we could look at Wyoming. There's like 500,000 people in Wyoming, but they're not a city, right? And one of the reasons for that is population density. So once the population density hits 1,000 people per square mile, and for comparison's sake, New York, Manhattan, parts of Manhattan, I think have population densities around 15,000 people per square mile. Surface imperviousness, pavement, the percent of the land that is impervious because it's got concrete or pavement on it, is one of the things that the Census Department looks at. in defining or deciding if a given place is a city or is it a census-defined place. And a census-defined place is, it doesn't have, for example, it's not incorporated as a city. So legally, it's not a city. This incorporation is it's a legal process. So, for example, there's the city of Davis, there's city limits, there's a charter. But one of the other ways of looking at this is the amount of land that is paved within that city. And census-defined places are areas where they might have enough density that they're acting exactly like an incorporated city, but they're not incorporated, so they are a census-defined place. But they wouldn't actually be a city. Contiguity, are they contiguous? Are they blobbed together? This is something that really affects places in, well, Southern California, for example, on the East Coast, where the cities start growing into each other. Like at some point, Elk Grove would be an example. Probably when Elk Grove started, there was a gap in population density between Sacramento and Elk Grove. But as time goes by, the city of Sacramento and Elk Grove are kind of going to grow together. And then at some point, for different statistical means, you just have to consider them all part of the same urban region. So here's Hazard, Kentucky. This is their main drag back in 1967, showing the main street in a city. There is a hierarchy of cities. The largest are combined statistical areas. For example, New York City's combined statistical area includes parts of New Jersey, parts of eastern Pennsylvania, parts of Connecticut. So they're kind of looking at it they're looking at it in terms of a functional region, that it's acting as if, well, they're all linked together. They're all connected together by flows of money and people and cars and transportation and all that stuff. So the largest area then is a combined statistical area. Smaller than that is a metropolitan statistical area. And that might be defined, that area that they're considering part of that urban area could also be defined based on commute times. So based on, like a half hour or an hour drive out of Sacramento, you could consider that region to be the metropolitan statistical area for Sacramento. For example, in Southern California, there's the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Santa Ana metropolitan statistical area that incorporates all of that entire stretch from Los Angeles to Long Beach to Santa Ana. There's micropolitan. Those are tiny, tiny, tiny. 10,000 to 50,000 for an anchor city within that area. So the micro is referring to the city not being bigger than 50,000 people within that micropolitan statistical area. And then finally, there's just rural areas that would have low density, not a lot of pavement per square mile. So, urban locations. Urban locations, like where you actually put a city at the founding of a city. So we're not talking about like where cities necessarily, yeah, I'm just going to back up. That's cool. Urban locations. So we're talking about where cities were placed. Cities have to be built. Somebody has to decide to start constructing a city. So there's two main forces that we can look at to see where they put cities. So one of them is site factors, and site factors refer to the intrinsic characteristics of that location. So it is, the site factors are something about that location that was special, as opposed to situation factors. Situation factors are where that location is relative to other places or other factors. So site factors, it's intrinsic, and situational factors are extrinsic. It's not necessarily that location itself was great, but that location with regards to other places made it a great location to put the city. So this is Sacramento. We'll look at other reasons to place cities. some of the reasons, site factors in this map. This is 1873 with, you can see the grid, the very clear grid layout of Sacramento, which looks like they've aligned the grid just like Davis. The grid isn't aligned north-south. The grid is aligned to magnetic north. Oh, and the railroad. So I'm not sure what which came first, but yeah, so that's what this diagram is actually showing, is if you walked along that line, you'd end up at the North Pole. This is where your compass is actually pointing, which is to the west about 15 degrees of the geographic North Pole. The magnetic North Pole is south of the North Pole and in the waters off of Canada. But I think the grids were laid out relative to the railroads, and it looks like the railroads were probably laid out to relative to magnetic north, not true or geographic north. So anyway, some of the site factors would be the rivers, the American River, the Sacramento River, which goes all the way to San Francisco and the Golden Gate. And the situation factors would be its location relative to the gold fields in the foothills. Defensibility. One of the oldest reasons for cities was defense. This is Prague. Most of the oldest cities in the world, especially those that are still important, were places where people could defend that city. So like I said, this is the castle gates in Prague in the Czech Republic. And here is a view. There's part of the walls, a view across the river. I think we're looking downriver at that point. View from the castle in Prague overlooking the river. It's a good spot to control traffic on the river. Yeah, I can see the town, or at least the town on the other banks. I can see the walls of the fortress. And so here is the fortress, and I took a look at it in Google Earth. And in fact, I made up a little tour of some of these places so that you could actually go and look at it in Google Earth and see. Here is the castle, and it's a star-shaped castle. Back in the days, one of the ways to break into a castle was to tunnel under the walls and then blow up the wall, and then everybody could just run in. So they created these really intricate system of walls so that they could shoot at the people that were trying to tunnel under their walls. And here you can see again, the castle is in an excellent position to control traffic going up and down river. In terms of defensibility, this is a star fort in Portugal, and it's up on a hilltop, which means that they've got gravity on their side, and it's overlooking a town, and that's also in the tour. Some cities, again, defensible position. Here's a castle that's overlooking, well, this now modern town. You can see the crumbling walls of the castle there, overlooking the town. They've got the tactical high ground over this village. So you can see they've got great visibility. I think this picture also taken from that fort. You've got great visibility up and down the valley. This is an important river, so you can see who's going up and down the river. Another example of defense would be starting your city on a river or on an island in a river, like Ile de la Cité in Paris. So that's Notre Dame in Paris. Notre Dame is on Ile de la Cité, the island of the city in Paris. There's the Eiffel Tower. This is all. I just took a quick screen grab from Google Earth, but you can see that's a great spot. Well, if the bridges weren't there, it would be very easy to defend this, as well as very easy, again, to control river traffic going up and down the river. So you could do things like make people pay taxes to you. So some defensive strategies, Acropolis, places that are high, like that first castle that we saw in Italy. Islands, we just saw that. Remote sites, here you go. What city in the U.S., it's an important one, was ransacked and burnt to the ground by the British Army in 1812? I'll give you a hint. They had to paint parts of it white to cover up the burn marks. That's right. It's the White House was burned in the War of 1812. So California. What city in California was founded largely on the site factor of defensibility? Well, here's the entire San Francisco Bay, and you can see to get into the bay, you got to go through this strait, this narrow opening, and the strait itself was called the Golden Gate. So if we zoom in a bit more, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge, which is painted orange, and I think a lot of people think it's called the Golden Gate Bridge because it's painted orange or gold, but actually this strait in the entrance to the bay was called the Golden Gate, and you can see right there, and I had no idea until recently, this is Fort Point that was built by the U.S. government well before the Golden Gate Bridge to control access to San Francisco Bay. And there's another picture. It was designed to support 141 cannons, which is a considerable amount of cannons. So anybody sailing into the Golden Gate would be literally a sitting duck for this fort. Here's some of the cannons. Notice the Marin headlands in the background. Yeah, that's a 10-inch cannon back in 1915. Crazy to think that they were going to defend the Golden Gate with actual 10-inch cannons and whatnot. Site factors, sometimes religion. For example, this is Salt Lake City, founded by Mormons. International cities. Which cities in the U.S. have religious origins? Oh, I just told you. Yeah. Salt Lake City. Situation is, again, where the city is in relationship to other places and other things. So market towns would have existed where people would come to market, and the text gives a couple of really good examples of places that started as a market town where farmers and other tradespeople would come and sell their stuff. Central places, trade sites, break of bulk points. We talked about this in the chapter on economics, where, for example, container ships come in. Oakland would be a break of bulk point where these huge container ships are coming in and they're taking the containers off the ship and then possibly further breaking down those containers. Rivers turn out to be huge. Fall line cities is a word that I didn't think I would be going on and on and on about this semester, but here we are. So this is the fall line. This line going up the East Coast, geologically, this part is relatively flat, and then you get into the mountains. And so the fall line is literally this line where there are waterfalls. So traveling upriver, you'd only be able to travel upstream until you hit the first waterfall, and then you can't proceed past it. So you either have to portage and go around it, or break of bulk, take everything off that ship and transport it some other way to get it to where you want it to go. Head of navigation, it refers to where you can start sailing. That's the same thing. Head of navigation is where you can sail up to or down from. So like here we've got Augusta, Georgia, on the Savannah River. So you can sail up the Savannah River as far as Augusta, Georgia. So Augusta would be the head of navigation for the Savannah River. Going from Augusta down to the ocean, you can navigate just fine, but you probably can't go upstream from Augusta. Portage towns. Portage refers to carrying either the boat or the stuff that was in the boat. Ford is a crossing of a river. So some cities started because they were an important ford site to get across a major river, for example. Choke points are places where you just have to get through there. For example, if you're traveling from Southern California to Northern California and you're traveling up 5, one of the choke points would be like the Grapevine down at the south end. Oh, and then up at the north end, there would be up by Mount Shasta. Some of the passes over the higher mountains there could act as choke points, that there's really no other way to get past that range of mountains than going through that one area. And then cities were built up there, probably to serve travelers. Could have also been a break of bulk point. choke points, confluence where two rivers come together. Here's another map showing, yeah, here we've got, hey, it's the Black Belt soils from day one. They're still with us. So this line was sketched out by a geographer showing where the fall line is. So you could sail up all these rivers up until that red line. And then you weren't going inland past the red line. So the Appalachians, I did not realize how really isolated the Appalachians are. So they're internally difficult to get around because they're these rugged, relatively, well, they're mountains. They're not rugged, they're round, they're old. But they are mountains, they are valleys. And if you were trying to bring material up on a boat, you're only going to make it halfway to the Appalachians. So we got fall line cities. Another way of looking at it, this is actual, it's a digital elevation model rendering of elevations. And you can see, yeah, I mean, on this map, it's nice. And this map is the same data shown a different way. So the importance, I didn't realize how many Petersburg, Richmond, Virginia, I didn't realize Augusta, Georgia, Macon, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama. I did not realize that all of those were important fall line cities. The falls, so this is Louisville, Kentucky, and it's showing the original 6 early settlements at the falls of the Ohio. So you could bring material up the Ohio River as far as Louisville, and now they've put a canal to bypass the falls, but before they put in the canal, back in the day, you could make it to Louisville, and then you'd have to unload and take material overland. Or offload material and then put it on another boat upstream from the falls. Oh, and a fall city in California is the bustling metropolis of Red Bluff. I'll bet you never realized that Red Bluff was an important city. Well, it used to be. And if you take a look at the notes, you can see this. Peter Lassen, he had a ranch that he got from the Mexican government. Wow, 24,000 acres, about 20 miles southeast of Red Bluff. He was going to make a town, but then there was the gold rush and everybody got busy south. In the late 1940s, riverboat traffic began expanding northward along the Sacramento River. Lassen's initial attempt to navigate to his ranch in 1849 failed. In 1850, he managed to make... sorry. I just can't imagine taking 125 miles. It took him 5 months to try to go upriver in a riverboat. In 1850, took him 5 months, but then eventually the boat sunk. I hope you have better luck navigating this chapter than Peter Lassen's riverboat that took 5 months to make it from Sac to Red Bluff and then finally sank. So taking a look at the East Coast, I think we'll get there in a minute, but looking at Google Earth and taking screen grabs, one of the ideas we'll talk about later is Kristalller's central place theory, and thinking of that as one of those hierarchical arrangements or a way of distributing cities into a hierarchy, right? Like not every city on here gets a name. At some point, like Terre Haute, Indiana looks pretty small. There's no ring road. Like Columbus, you can see there's a circular road, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Louisville, Greensboro, Charlotte, Fayetteville, Richmond, Washington, D.C., Baltimore. They all have a peripheral ring road to get around that goes around the outside, or maybe not the outside of the city. But I thought that was interesting that Indianapolis is a decent sized city, Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. And they're all spaced, Cincinnati to Louisville, Louisville to Indianapolis, Indianapolis to Fort Wayne, Indianapolis to Chicago. That's a little bit farther. But the spacing seemed to be pretty regular. Oh, that would be a really fun GIS project. You could calculate out the distance between different levels of hierarchical cities. Like you could have a layer that would just be the capitals, or maybe even better would be the main city in each state, the largest city in each state, and see how far apart they are. So like Chicago would be a first order city. New York City would be a first order city. Los Angeles would be a first order city. And then maybe like Columbus, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Louisville, Pittsburgh, those would be second order cities. And then measuring the distance, those would be closer together and there would be more of them. And then the third order cities would be even smaller. So that'd be like Terre Haute, Champaign, Peoria, Davenport, Dubuque, Madison, all these smaller cities that are so small in their spatial extent that they don't have a ring road to go around it. So those would be even closer still. But that would be a fun GIS project if you get really bored. So, that's what it was. I was zooming into Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh is at the confluence of two important rivers. So that's cool. So there's good transportation by the river, and I didn't think of it, but Dr. Graves points out there's like 140 bridges around Pittsburgh. So the river going up and down river is great transportation, but if you want to go from one side of the river to the other, you need bridges, right? So the river acts as a means of transportation and also a barrier to transportation, depending on if you're in a boat or not. Oh, yeah. And then I was just playing around with Google Earth because I love Google Earth. And you can see Chicago and you can see the freeways extending out from Chicago. You can also see the effects of the township and range system. Each of these little white dots, those are larger cities. Well, I mean, Chicago, the larger the city. Oh, big city, big city, big city, big city, big city, big city, small 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 city. And then I thought, oh, what if you turn on the road layer so you can compare what it looks like with the roads. And then indeed, those larger cities are all connected up by the interstate highway system, but not those smaller cities. And then I turned on the names of the cities. So yeah, these were those second and third order cities then, like Omaha, Lincoln, Des Moines, Iowa City, Davenport, Cedar Rapids, Cedar Falls. So now these names, I think the city names are hopefully going to be making more sense. When we're talking about toponyms, like Cedar Falls, I'm guessing it's called Cedar Falls because there's waterfalls there, which means that you wouldn't be able to move upriver beyond Cedar Falls. New York City has break of bulk advantages. Also, Los Angeles, Chicago, New Orleans, and Houston are examples of cities that are partially there because of the break of bulk advantage. New York City also has the Erie Canal. They also have a harbor, the port. So here's the Erie Canal. So you could sail all the way up the Hudson River to Schenectady and then take the Erie Canal over to Buffalo and get out onto the Great Lakes. So you could go all the way from the ocean upstream to Schenectady and then cut over on the Erie Canal, and bada bing, bada boom, you're on the Great Lakes. And then those canals would have connected Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse and Schenectady with Troy and then New York City. Chicago has several situation factors. What are a few? Well, it was a portage site where people would have to get out of the boat, get everything out of the boat. It was the site of two important rivers, and the Illinois-Michigan, another canal. Canals were super important right up until the mid-1800s with the development of the railroad. So we see this is going to be a shout out to the chapter on development because we talked about the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s. By the mid 1800s, railroads were the dominant means of transportation in the United States, eclipsing canals. Los Angeles site factors, well, situation factors. It's got a harbor. It's got a big open plain. It's got water from the Los Angeles River. Later, after the railroad came through, it was a break of bulk point for the Santa Fe and also Southern Pacific railroads, so that's important. And then the development of the reefer car or refrigerated refrigerated railroad car was a huge boost to the citrus industry. So another important theme that I haven't really hammered on as much this semester as I maybe should have is that changes in communication and technology have often really dramatic spatial effects. So in this case, because they had invented a refrigerated railroad car, it meant that you could get fresh produce to market without it going bad, which then incentivized the growing of citrus and other high-value perishable fruits and vegetables for sale in a distant market. So it's interesting that what happened far away with the development of the reefer car had profound effects for Southern California in terms of what their agricultural and economic activities were. And then later, Los Angeles discovered oil. Oh, yeah. So this is the Los Angeles harbor today. This is a Google Earth shot. And when I was looking at it in Google Earth, I was looking at this and thought, oh, yeah, look at all those cars. Like driving back and forth to the Bay Area. You've probably seen some of the car storage area when they break of bulk, take the cars off of the ship, the boats that ship them over. But then I realized once I zoomed in more, those are actually containers, like those, whatever. I don't actually know how long they are. I was going to make up a number, but I'm not going to. So this is just row after row after row of those massive shipping containers and then the huge cranes that are required to offload boats. This is also a Google Earth screen grab of the LA harbor or the port of Long Beach. And now we're going to shift gears, talking about why cities are where they are, to how cities get laid out. And this is Christoller's central place theory. And the central place theory is a model to explain, well, heck, why those plain states look the way they do. We were just looking at this, where you'd have a city that's a higher order place, and then you'd have the blue dots are towns, which are smaller, and then even smaller than the towns are villages. So Christoller thought that if everything else is equal, and on many of the flat plain states, there's no necessary geographic advantage to being one place or another because everything's flat, there's no rivers in some areas. So cities tend to organize themselves in this manner. In this case, situation is weight. There aren't any site factors. Everything is situation. Where are you relative to other things? And then in this town, or I'm sorry, in the city, in the higher order place, in the city, there's going to be more people. Because there's more people, there's going to be those services that you're only going to find with a large enough population. So you'd find those in this town, but not here, and definitely not here. And that's the idea of threshold in terms of population. How many people do you need to get a whatever? And then the range is how far are people willing to drive for things? And people are willing to drive or travel long distances for rare and important things. People are not willing to drive long distances for common things. So again, we've got this urban hierarchy of cities to towns to village. We have mega cities. For example, Los Angeles would be a mega city. New York is a mega city. Sacramento, I would say, is like a second tier city in California. San Francisco and Los Angeles for California, I would say, are like first order cities. Sacramento would be a second order city. So we might have regional service centers in Sacramento. This is a map of Bugatti dealerships, the incredibly expensive sports cars. So there's either 2 or 3 in Southern California. I think there might have been one in like Newport. There's 2 down in like Miami Beach and Palm Beach. There's a couple around New York, but there just aren't enough people here who want to buy Bugattis to make it worth their time to open up a dealership there. So this is, again, the idea that there's a threshold. You need to have so many people who are making this much money in the town to bother opening a super expensive exotic car dealership. Major League Baseball has a threshold of around 2 million people. Walmart has a threshold of about 20,000 people. Starbucks has a threshold of around 5,000 people. So, and I'm not sure what metric they're using when they say 5,000 people. Do they mean 5,000 people who are working there during the day? 5,000 people within a 15-minute walk, within a 15-minute drive? I don't know. But if they have 5,000 people close enough to a Starbucks, they would probably open up a new one. Sacramento Trader Joe's. I remember back before they opened a Trader Joe's in Davis, every time you'd go to the Trader Joe's in Sacramento, they would ask you, what's your zip code? And it's for this threshold data. That's why they're asking. They're trying to get the zip code information of the people that are shopping at Trader Joe's. Although it just occurred to me, since everybody's using most of the people, like I don't remember the last time I saw somebody use like cash or a check at Trader Joe's. But since it's all electronic, they have all that data. They track everything that we do electronically. Everything you do electronically is tracked electronically. So they would have known exactly how many people a day are coming into Trader Joe's from Davis. And eventually, if they get enough people, they would open up one in that town. Oh, urban morphology. Morph refers to shape. Ology is the study of. So it's the study of the shape of cities, how they're laid out. The spatial arrangement of people and industry. Infrastructure is key. Infrastructure is going to be things like roads, rail lines, railroad lines. The evolution of transportation infrastructure in the United States is key in this urban morphology, as we've gone from walking and horses to railroads to streetcars to automobiles. The cities have transformed at each step. Which transportation infrastructure is most important in creating the shape of New York and Chicago and Boston and San Francisco? The answer is rail lines. So this is in San Francisco. It's one of their old high-deck electric streetcars, and it looks like they bought this one off of the Louisville Railway Company. Interesting. Morphology. So this is the part where I'm going to go through a bunch of different models. And a model is just like an idea. Somebody has an idea. I think cities are laid out like this because of these factors, and therefore they look like this. So one of them is the concentric ring model, that downtown is the central. Yeah, I was looking through my notes and I looked at that and said CBD. I'm like, what? Oh, right. Central Business District, not cannabidiol. So we've got the central business district where the rent is the highest. That's where the skyscrapers are. That's where the expensive buildings are. And then you have the inner city, a zone of transition, working class housing, suburbs, exurbs. Examples of cities that have this concentric ring model would be Columbus, Indianapolis, with the most expensive land in the center. And then as you move away, the land gets less expensive. Although 3, the working class housing, would be less expensive than the suburbs. So it's that transportation coming into play, that you've got money to live a little farther out of town. This is the concentric ring model. Next up is the sector model, where you've got a central business district. And now instead, well, we've got some rings, but we also just have these like lines. And Chicago, great example of this, with, for example, the rail lines coming off the center. So the wealthy are going to live off of these rail stops, or the poorer people are going to live off the rail stops. The richer people are probably getting chauffeured to work in their cars. So we've got working class housing, suburbs, exurbs, but then we also have upper middle class, industry and the poor, working class housing on these like radial lines coming out the center based on some sort of transportation factor. So Chicago, again, an example of the sector model. After the automobile came in, so this could be explained using rail and light rail, which used to be incredibly important. But after the car came in, everything changed spatially. All those spatial relationships changed because the automobile made it really easy to get around very quickly. And so now it doesn't really matter where things are as much. So we have a central business district. We have industrial spaces wherever. We've got working class housing close to the downtown. Upper middle class, maybe, well, same place. I'm just going to say in this example, there's got to be some sort of site factors that we're unaware of. Like maybe it's prettier over here. The Graves text pointed out that the wealthy, I was going to say, where do we put the wealthy? 4. Elite housing, 4. So I'm just going to say that the wind is probably coming from this way, blowing that way. Graves points out that the wealthy typically live upwind from the stinky stuff. So the poor people have to live literally in the smelly places, and the wealthier people live upwind from noxious odors. Light industry and wholesale, commuters, and exurb industrial, like industrial parks that are on the outside of town. So this is all because of automobiles, and it doesn't matter where anything is anymore. Los Angeles, and because Los Angeles, the development of Los Angeles it happened at the same time as the automobile. The expansion and the growth and the shape of Los Angeles was largely a result of the automobile, although before that, much of the shape had already taken hold as a result of what was called the Red Line. It was an electric railway. So many of these places like Rancho Cucamonga, Ontario, here's downtown Los Angeles in this region. So many of these and then we've got freeways. The white lines are all freeways, but before that there was light rail. And so many of the cities that have now grown together into the sprawl of Los Angeles, many of them were commuter bedroom communities for people that would take light rail to work in downtown Los Angeles and then come out to the suburbs when their workday was over. Los Angeles is surprisingly dense. I never would have guessed at 5,000 residents per square mile. And I think, wasn't the threshold 1,000 at the beginning of this? So Los Angeles is 146% more dense than Boston. It's more dense than Dallas, Portland, Chicago, New York, and about as dense as San Francisco. And then there's this graphic in the book. So what somebody has done is taken the footprint of Portland and plopped it over Los Angeles. The spatial footprint of Chicago, and plopped it over Los Angeles. New York plopped on LA, Boston, Dallas, and San Francisco. So it's kind of interesting seeing the spatial scale of New York. That's Long Island. San Francisco, so like there's Marin, there's Los Angeles, San Francisco, all the way down to like San Jose. The Latin American model is a really interesting one. We've got a central business district, an older neighborhood. In situ accretion means things over time are appearing and growing and then growing onto each other. The squatter zone where the poor people live. So in this case, the wealthier are living closer to the central business district. Disamenity means it's bad, and the elite spine is where the rich people live. And it's all about transportation. Why are the suburbs favored by the poor and the inner city for the wealthy? The answer is transportation. The wealthy, it's easy for them to get there, and the poor, it's very difficult for them to get to the central business district to work because they live so far away, because the land here is more expensive. So because of transportation, it's better to live close to the central business district than it is to live far away from the central business district. Oh, yeah, I put this in here. This is the laws of the Indies. So the Spanish government said, hey, if you're Spanish and you're in another country and you want to make a city, that's cool. You just have to have 30 free men. It should be no less than 12 persons. and it should be in an elevated and healthy location. So they're talking about site and setting. So having made the selection of a site where the town is to be built, it has to be an elevated and healthy location. You have to be able to fortify it, to defend it. It has to have soil, land for farming and pasturage, fuel, timber, and resources, fresh water, a native population to enslave and work, a native population to enslave and work, ease of transport, access and exit, be open to the north wind. What if you're in the southern hemisphere? If you're on the coast, you should have a good harbor. If possible, not near lagoons or marshes in which poisonous animals and polluted air and water breed. This would be back in the day when the disease malaria, literally malaria, bad air. They thought that it was noxious fumes, not mosquitoes. Yeah, that's interesting. Shall try as far as possible to have the buildings all of one type for the sake of beauty of the town. Fascinating. They need a commons so that the population may experience expansion. There's always enough space for people to go for recreation and take their cattle to pasture without making any damage. And then some early zoning, the site and building lots for slaughterhouses, fisheries, tanneries where they make animal skins into leather, and other businesses which produce filth shall be placed so that the filth can be easily disposed of. Fascinating. So the Spanish back in the 1600s had these ideas about city planning. They were doing urban planning back in the 1600s. City life. Well, we have neighborhoods that have distinctive characters within the city. So I think really the neighborhood is the scale at which cities are transformed. They change. They become something other. NIMBY is a phrase, it's an acronym for not in my backyard. And typically it refers to people opposing projects that would be good. Yeah, it's a great idea. Yes, we clearly need housing for the homeless. But I don't want it in my town. I don't want it in my neighborhood. Put it someplace else, would be the NIMBY response to that. Graves refers to Mike Davis, who is a Southern California geographer. He's written a lot about urban spaces. And one of the things he talks about is the militarization of space. And by that, he's referring to gated communities that might have armed guards at the gate. Gated communities. Environmental racism is an aspect of city life, that the poorer neighborhoods are where the crappy stuff is going to happen. The smelly things are going to be, the polluting things are going to be, because they might not be aware of it. And if they are aware, they don't have a political voice like the wealthy do. Within a neighborhood, there's often a life cycle, or the idea that there is a life cycle. It's interesting how ideas have changed about, well, is there a neighborhood life cycle? Is there just one? Does it depend on that neighborhood in particular, that the site factors would be more important than these larger ideas that urban theorists are thinking about? So housing gets older. Things that happens in neighborhoods, redlining, that would prevent people of color from moving in, blockbusting, that would encourage white people to leave, steering. All the things that we talked about in the last chapter are fully still in effect in neighborhoods and cities now. Redlining, blockbusting, steering, all those things. Suburbanization. So in the 1970s, yes, it all makes sense now. As the result of the great migration of African Americans out of the South to northern and western cities, that white flight happened at this same time, with white people fleeing the cities for the suburbs. And the suburbs really became the last refuge of racism. That people who were threatened by the existence of people of color wanted to move to neighborhoods that would be all white. And often redlining enforced this, that the cities were able to still be racist. Streetcar suburbs changed city life. These suburbs sprang up as the result of streetcars. Here's an early streetcar. And in red on this map, this is the red line. And not the red line that's racist, but the red line that was the electric light rail that ran if you know Los Angeles, it ran all the way out to the valley, all the way out to San Bernardino, all the way down to Corona and Riverside. Just amazing. This was neglected, and finally it was destroyed by a group of fossil fuel, automobile, and tire companies that actually eventually took control of the red line and then destroyed it by not doing maintenance. So it became run down, and eventually they said, well, it's just going to cost too much to fix. And besides, everybody has a car. Can't we tear it out? And I find it totally fascinating that Los Angeles now has light rail. There was resistance. Nobody thought it would work. But the new urban light rail in Los Angeles is incredibly popular. So everything old is new again. Redlining in Los Angeles with areas of the good areas, not as good, and then just bad. Further creating those situations of racist enclaves. And it's interesting in Santa Monica. In fact, I would really like to drop a map. When they put the freeway in, they ran it through the poor neighborhoods, which turned out to be a double whammy because then they have noise and air pollution from the cars, but also lead from the gasoline. So they're actually causing brain damage in low-income neighborhoods as the result of lead exposure. Neighborhood life cycle. It's the idea that neighborhoods have a life cycle. They're baby neighborhoods, they're desirable neighborhoods, they get old, they get run down, they're less desirable, and then they get sometimes torn down and rebuilt. So I think neighborhood life cycle is, to me, a much easier, it's a smaller scale, so it's easier to understand than the idea that like a city itself also has a life cycle, or a city goes through stages of growth. So the New Deal, President Roosevelt was trying to encourage people to buy homes. So we had an expansion of housing. This, I think, also fits in with the HOLC, the group that was responsible for creating redlining. The GI Bill, after World War II, American GIs were eligible for low-interest subsidized loans on housing. So there was a massive expansion of the suburbs that was caused by the GI Bill. The GI Bill also then allowed for white flight to occur. So white flight was when, at the time of the Great Migration, right, we saw how many cities, the population of people of color in that city exploded as the result of African Americans leaving the incredibly racist and dangerous South for places in the North, like Detroit, where they could get jobs making automobiles. And so as African Americans moved into the cities, racist white people, fled the cities for the suburbs. And often that white flight was also furthered and accelerated by realtors who would tell other white families, like once an African-American family moves in, they would go to other white families and talk them into leaving the neighborhood before their house was worthless because those people would have moved in. The only thing that's changed over time in the United States is the actual group of people that we're referring to as those people that were undesirable for whatever reason. So white flight was when white racist people moved from the cities to the suburbs, which is really interesting because I've never thought of it that way, but in some of the movies you'll see next week on the suburbs that you created these conditions created conditions in the suburbs that would be attractive to racist white people that would encourage other racist white people to move to the suburbs, making the suburbs more racist. So redlining, we've already talked about the discriminatory practice of not giving loans to fully qualified people just because of their race. Oh, I forgot to mention, one of the ways that you can do redlining is by making people include photographs on their loan application, because we're a friendly neighborhood loan organization and we just want to get to know you as a person. Oh, you're black, you don't get a loan. That's kind of the way that worked. So reverse redlining is when people in communities of color, in disadvantaged communities, in the redlined areas, in the red areas, are deliberately targeted for high interest loans and other predatory lending practices. So reverse redlining is when they go into vulnerable communities, communities of people of color, communities where they are lower on the socioeconomic status, their wages are lower, and then they're targeted, just like payday loans, the incredibly expensive loans that people can get on their paychecks. Reverse redline was the same kind of idea, targeting the poor and the vulnerable and trying to make lots and lots of money off of them. The Fair Housing Act did away with many of these racist practices. Urban renewal. Here we see an area that's scheduled for demolition. The neighborhood was getting run down, and so often, rather than just improve the existing neighborhood, oh man, it just occurred to me the amount of money that is spent to make things better. That seems like at this point, yeah. So this is like my second or third time the slides, and this is the second or third time that I've looked at this slide and tried to narrate it. And it just occurred to me how much money would have been saved if they had instead maybe subsidized repair of these people's homes. So instead of spending millions of dollars and creating these tax advantages for other wealthier people to move in, that a much easier thing to do would be help people maintain the homes that they have, but we're not really interested in that. So urban renewal is when they take neighborhoods that are usually poor neighborhoods, and tear them down and make them into neighborhoods for people that aren't poor, because then it looks nice. Well, the problem, I don't think, is that it didn't look nice. The problem is that it was occupied by poor people, and somebody said, hey, I can make more money off of this land if we get rid of the poors. So yeah, destroy it and they will come. Blight is the term for the unattractive visual aspect of a neighborhood. Highways and freeways were often put through lower income neighborhoods because they didn't have the political skills to fight having a noisy, polluting, and especially back in the days when there was leaded gasoline. Lead causes brain damage. So we had freeways with high traffic counts deliberately being run through lower income neighborhoods because the rich people didn't want a highway through their neighborhood. Let's put it through the poor people's neighborhood, which then contributes to noise, blight, and also toxic living conditions. This creates commuter towns with people no longer wanting to live here. They want to, well, fine, if I can move someplace else because I have the money, I can live in a nicer place and then commute to downtown. And exurbs are one of the terms for that. Exurbs are neighborhoods that are located farther from town than the suburbs, but they're populated with the wealthy. So the exurbs are like suburbs for the wealthy that are farther out of town. The Federal Highway Act. Eisenhower was impressed with these military freeways. The Autobahn in Germany that was constructed to allow the Germans to move military equipment around very quickly on these wide, high-speed concrete roads, instead of in the United States, many of the 4-lane or 6-lane or 8-lane highways that we have now used to be 2-lane roads. So the military highways after World War II led directly to suburbanization. They had already ripped out the streetcar lines for the most part by this point in the 1950s, and the car and the freeway replaced the streetcar line with people moving to the suburbs because they could commute. Commuting times, half an hour to an hour, is about what's considered normal or average or acceptable in this country. Again, we've got exurbs as a result of these highways. Yeah, if it took people like 4 hours to drive from their house in the foothills to Sacramento, very few people would want to live in exurbs. Lateral commuters are when people go from one suburb to another suburb, rather than commuting from a suburb in the morning to the central business district during the day. The lateral commuters are just going sideways from one community to another suburban community. The Federal Highway Act led to sprawl, which is when developments leapfrog and are created, grow farther and farther and farther and farther and farther from town. Another type of sprawl is just when the city just grows without necessarily there being a lot of control over the zoning or the land use. And so you get dysfunctional cities that were not designed, but cities that just happened. And as opposed to older cities growing organically in response to the needs of the inhabitants of the city, what we see with sprawl is the patterns of growth of sprawl are dictated by who can make the most money the fastest. So we end up seeing things like, well, I look at Natomas, right? North Natomas, that whole development is in a floodplain that we know will be under 15 to 20 feet of water. But economically, the developer made bank and then got out. So we see bad decisions being made for short-term economic profit. Sprawl is one example of that. And then the external costs are borne by all of us. So the cost of the freeway is paid by all of the Americans. The cost of maintaining that freeway and the cost of the pollution is borne by all of us. So the New Deal under Roosevelt created economic conditions for people to buy homes. The GI Bill, soldiers coming back from World War II were given low interest loans by the government to buy homes. The homes that people were able to buy during the New Deal and the homes that people were able to buy during the GI Bill at this time, so post World War II, mid to late 40s, the 1950s is really when the explosion in suburbia happened across the United States. Again, there was white flight from the cities to the suburbs, and all of this was accelerated and perpetuated by the systemic racism in the United States with the home loan, the redlining with the home loans, the steering, all the things that we've talked about before, just accelerated this racial transformation of white people moving out of cities as people of color moved to the cities, white people moved to the suburbs. Redlining. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 did away with redlining, made it illegal. However, as we saw last week, many of those racist deeds still exist, and that language is still in the deeds, although it's illegal. It would be illegal to enforce those provisions. Urban renewal. I'm going to say it's one of those things that sounds like a good idea, but it was often done very poorly. Urban renewal is the idea that over time, neighborhoods get run down, which is questionable. I mean, it's a statement, but it's something that we can question. Well, do they though? Why does that happen? Why do neighborhoods over time degrade, become lower quality? The houses get run down. People aren't taking care of them. And so at various points in time, the government's response was, well, we'll just wipe out everything and start over. Urban renewal, especially of downtown areas, contributed to the homelessness problem because in these urban areas, in these lower income areas in cities, there were often single occupancy or single resident only hotels, flop houses, cheap places to live for working people or people down on their luck, poor people. So the rents were very, very low. The standards, the quality of these places was also very low, but they were there. So if you tear out and destroy all of the places where poor people can live, what happens to them? Well, they become homeless. So the whole idea of urban renewal, it was a good idea. We want to make the cities nice. We want to make them attractive. We want to make them pleasant. We want to make them nice places to live and experience. But the response was just bulldoze everything and we'll start off with something different. Blight is the term for these neighborhoods that are run down. Highways and freeways contribute to this because they put highways and freeways through some of these neighborhoods. Highways and freeways also allow people, if they have the money, to move out of these neighborhoods to commuter towns in the suburbs. Exurbs are farther away than the suburbs. The Federal Highway Act, with the military highways, the Federal Highway Act under Eisenhower. Eisenhower saw the Autobahn of Germany and how useful that was during World War II for the Germans to move military equipment around on these huge roads, which led to highways. Instead of like a 2-lane road, everything was now 4 lanes in each direction, or 3 lanes in each direction for a 6-lane highway, which then further accelerated suburbanization because we had freeways where you can drive really fast. So now the distance is less important, right? If you had to commute, like me, I live in Davis. After we go back to the classroom, I'll commute to school. But if I had to commute to Davis and it was just a 2-lane road, that would be nuts. It would be impossible. So the creation of these really wide, high volume, high speed roads led to the development of suburbs and encouraged suburbanization across the United States. Commuting times around an hour, half an hour to an hour is considered an acceptable commute by most people. Exurbs, like I said, suburban. If it's urban, it's a city. If it's not quite urban, it's below that, it's suburban. And if it's not even close, it's exurbs. Lateral commuters are people that are going sideways. And the Federal Highway Act ultimately led to sprawl. Like the idea that Lincoln would be a commuter community for Sacramento, I would say, is an example of what we're talking about. So sprawl is when the cities grow bigger and bigger and bigger, or the little suburbs keep popping up outside the cities, and then another ring outside that would pop up and another ring outside that as people buy all the homes in those suburbs, they have to build new suburbs for new people, and they just keep getting farther and farther away. So then there's more and more and more traffic. I found this diagram, how the automobile changed America's life, and I thought it was really nice. It's from the 40s or so, and it's a lot of things that we've talked about. So blighted areas, suburban communities where people are moving outside the city, abandoned railroads as they weren't as important for transportation. You could have a hospital that would serve several counties now because you can drive there. Consolidated schools and libraries for the same reason. Larger mechanized farms. So this was written at the time when the automobile was actually having these changes. All of us now, this has already happened. Was that 80 years ago? Let's say the 40s and 50s. This happened like 80 years ago. That's crazy. The San Fernando Valley is areas of more and less urban. Although in each of these, we've got, 0 to 5. So I don't know, maybe not that, but persons per square mile, 107,000 people per square mile. That's definitely dense. So I would have done this differently. I would have put another break in there and had, I would 0 to 1,000, then 1,000 to 5,000 is how I would have broken that out. Cause then I would want to know, like Van Nuys, Northridge. Do they qualify as urban? I'm just going to say yes. Checkerboard sprawl. So each of these is probably a square mile. And the text also refers to leapfrog sprawl, where instead of building out this one and then that one and then that one, like if the city is here and it's growing to the top of the picture, Instead of filling in and then filling in and then filling in, checkerboard is like, well, what they're doing here, where they filled that in, and then maybe they'll fill in that one. So the sprawl is continuing to get farther and farther and farther apart. Oh, and then there's edge cities, the counter to the central business district. These are cities or city spaces on the edges of cities. And they're really weird. They're the opposite of places. Yeah. Tyson's Corner, Virginia is an example of one of these edge cities. It's a top 20 city in terms of office space, but there's only 20,000 people that live there. During the day, probably 100,000 people that have commuted to work. And then at night, they all go home. Garreau defined an edge city as a location that has at least 5 million square feet of office space, has at least 600,000 square feet of retail space, so shopping malls, has more jobs than bedrooms, so the opposite of a bedroom community. Like a bedroom community is one where the commuters live. So they go someplace else to buy stuff. They go someplace else to go to work. They go home to go to sleep. So that's what a bedroom community is. So it's the opposite, the exact opposite of a bedroom community. People live in bedroom communities that work in edge cities. It's recognized as a vernacular place by locals, but not necessarily by outsiders. So, because I'm an outsider, I don't know, I don't have an example because I'm an outsider. Oh, and to be an edge city, you can't exist. They're new. As part of the growth cycle of cities, this would be an example of blight. You can see the sidewalks aren't maintained, the streets aren't maintained. Looks like there's missing boarded up windows in some of these houses. So one of the things that drives capital flight is return on investment, that if you owned this building, there might not be any point investing in it because you're not going to get any money out of it. At which point you walk away from it or you tear it down. Over time, it becomes less valuable. That's what depreciation is. Disinvestment. Yeah, if I own this, I'm gonna dump it. I'm going to set it on fire and claim it as an insurance loss. I'm going to do something with it, but I'm not going to fix it up and make it beautiful because there's no point because the rest of the neighborhood is shot. Movement of capital, money is going to go where it's going to make more money. And this is Jimmy Carter. This is the Bronx. This is New York. In the Bronx, back in the 70s, early 80s, this is what parts of New York looked like. Yeah, it's not a very attractive landscape. Something should be done. And sometimes what happens is gentrification, which is, all right. So as I mentioned, movement of capital to other location. So if this was a rundown neighborhood, it hasn't been maintained, the buildings haven't been fixed up. Gentrification is when wealthy people or wealthier, it's all relative, right? Wealthier people move in and start fixing it up. And typically what happens then, as people come in and fix it up, the property tax, or rather the worth of these other buildings is going to go up. And then maybe somebody else moves in here and fixes it up. And then the neighborhood becomes better. Typically what happens is the people, the residents of the neighborhood at some point get priced out of their own home. Their home is now worth so much money that they can't afford to pay the property tax on it. And so they have to leave, and then another yuppie moves in and the neighborhood gets better in that there's an infusion of money, but the original residents have been forced out of their homes, and so they're going to have to find a low-income neighborhood to live in now. So gentrification, this is after gentrification, the Red Parrot restaurant. Typically, there's tax boosts involved. The economy is changing. Like maybe there was nothing here before, or maybe the building's just been sitting vacant, but now it's a nice restaurant. People would think, oh, it seems like the neighborhood's changing. It might be okay to live there now. Baby boomers love gentrification with their altered life cycle. Kids are out of the house. They don't need the same things that they needed anymore. They have more disposable income. I already mentioned the original residents often get displaced because they can no longer afford to live in that neighborhood. Some examples of gentrification. Gentrification, just so you know. I see white people. We are the heart of Harlem. In San Francisco, for San Francisco, in fact, many of the dot-com boom places, gentrification has occurred with much resistance from the local communities. And some other, the organic model of gentrification, bohemians, artists, creative people moving into a lower rent neighborhood because they can afford it, and then gradually fixing up their homes, and then the neighborhood becomes better, wealthier. You still get the displacement, but it's just a different way of gentrification happening. Bohemians, these lower income people, typically have sweat equity. They maybe don't have the money, but they have the time and the skills to fix up the houses, so they get improved. Rainbow neighborhoods. I was going to say, this is, I think, in Philadelphia. And one of the triangle that was initially used by the Nazis in the death camps to identify gay people for death, for murder, was adopted by the gay community during the AIDS crisis. That was largely ignored by the American government. The U.S. government, Ronald Reagan, for example, was used, the triangle symbol for gay people was a symbol of resistance. And so often bohemians, creative people, the LGBTQ communities will move into these areas and fix them up. Okay, one of the things about using somebody else's book is every now and then you'll come across something that, well, it's probably the same as you, the student's experience looking at anything that I've done. What the hell are we looking at? Why did he choose this? What the hell is this supposed to mean? So, Graves in his materials mentions that this home is credited with a trend that began in 1969, and I looked at it and thought, I have no idea what he's talking about. This house wasn't. It doesn't look like it was built in 1969, unless like Victorian revival happened in 1969. So I did a Google image search on the image, and man, is it fascinating. This picture is perfect. I don't think Graves could have found a better picture to illustrate, to encapsulate. It's just it's a dense nugget that's packed with information and connections to other things that we've talked about. So what the hell are we looking at? Hey, we're looking at the Beith Dickey House, which is a Queen Anne Victorian, built in 1890. It was one of the houses of note when Inman Park, Atlanta's first streetcar suburb. Okay, so already we know that this house was in Atlanta, but in one of the suburban regions in Atlanta, not in the central business district, but streetcar close. So then, after Inman Park deteriorated due to the flight of the upper and middle classes to the suburbs, so it's not, it says that it's a streetcar suburb. It probably was when the city was so small it was at walking scale, but streetcars allow you to move faster, so it's still inside the city. And the flight of the upper and middle classes to the suburbs would, of course, be white flight, 1950s, 1960s. This house played a central role in the neighborhood's Renaissance. Interior designer Robert Bob Griggs and his partner Robert Aiken bought the house in 1969, and their renovation of the house sparked the conversion of Inman Park from a slum to a desirable in-town neighborhood. And I've included a link in the slides to the Wikipedia article about the gentrification of Atlanta. So, man, fantastic. But wait, there's more. So Inman Park was planned in the 1880s as a suburb connected to the central business district by electric streetcar. So here's a map of Atlanta's streetcar system and other transit in 1946. And the region that we're talking about is actually right here, right by the number 4. That is where Highland Park is. So there's the downtown region. So you can see that this suburb is really about, well, here's a scale bar. That's 2 miles. So I don't know, about 2 miles, mile and a half, 2 miles out of town. So maybe farther than you would want to walk every day, but on a streetcar, it wouldn't take you any time at all to get into town. So let's learn more about this Inman Park because it sounds delightful. The Atlantic Constitution in 1896 grandly described Inman Park, high above the city where the purest breezes and the brightest sunshine drove away the germs of disease, and where nature had lavished her best gifts. The gentleman who conceived the thought of Inman Park found the locality above all others which they desired. It was to be a place of homes, of pretty homes, green lawns, and desirable inhabitants. And all save those who would make desirable residents have been excluded. All save those who would make desirable residents have been excluded. I wonder what they mean by desirable. It is the prettiest, highest, healthiest, and most desirable locality I ever saw. Everyone is friendly and neighborly and white. And as far as accessibility, it ranks second to no residence portion of the city. We have 3 car lines and frequent schedules. That sounds great. I can't imagine anyone not wanting to live there. Like other new developments throughout the United States at the time, but in stark contrast to the attitudes prevalent in the neighborhood today, Inman Park was conceived of and promoted as a segregated, so it's a white racist community. Okay, great. The arrival of the automobile, and I just stole all of this from Wikipedia. Thank you, Wikipedia. You're fantastic. Love you. I always give money to Wikipedia when they ask for it. It is one of the most democratizing things ever. I think all of your teachers, if you were told that Wikipedia is wrong, did you a great disservice. Oh, don't use it. No, that's my starting place. Whenever I'm looking for material for a lecture, Wikipedia is my first place that I start looking at. Wikipedia gives you sources. What you need to do is start with Wikipedia, and if you really are getting into it, dig into the primary sources. Like all these links would have links to some sort of another Wikipedia article, but then links to the original documents when people are talking about these things. So the arrival of the automobile allowed upper-class Atlantans to live in suburbs. So it's exactly what this is a great example of everything about cities. So they had cars. Once they had cars, you could move farther away. And if you had the money, you would. So the people that are left behind are lower class. Inman Park became less fashionable, and the exuberant Victorian architecture dated. The mansions were subdivided into apartments. Similar to other in-town neighborhoods, Inman Park felt a blight during the white and middle-class exodus in the 50s and 60s and was an economically depressed neighborhood of mostly blue-collar white folks, elderly couples who couldn't move out, and families on disability and welfare. They lived in rented bungalows or big houses chopped up into tiny, roach-infested apartments, because if there's one thing it's not okay to be in the United States, it's poor. They were all roach-infested. None of them were attractive. I recognize that these people were lower income, but frankly, calling all of them tiny roach-infested apartments, I think that's slanderous. We move on to the further story of Inman Park. So they've got a great story about Robert and Bob, or Bob and Robert, finding the house, restoring it. So it was a multi-unit rental property. They had taken the house and chopped it up into multiple rental apartments. They converted it into a single-family dwelling. They were followed by others who restored homes, which would be gentrification. They founded Inman Park Restoration. The neighborhood association created a neighborhood newsletter, a garden club, a preschool. They began a tour of homes with a small festival. So we really see gentrification in full swing post-1969 in Inman Park, with then wealthier people moving in, at which point the property taxes are going to go up, and some of those people who were financially stuck there are going to be squeezed even harder because they can't necessarily move into anything close where all their friends are, where they've grown up, because now the property taxes and the cost of maintaining those homes is just too high. However, Inman Park is now regarded as a highly desirable in-town neighborhood with a mixture of rental and owner-occupied houses. The association ranges from tiny shotguns to the Victorian mansion. So it's got mixed, trying to think, there's got to be a word for that. Mixed housing. It's not mixed use, because mixed use is when you have like commercial and residential in the same space. This would be mixed classes. So you've got lower class or lower income people with tiny houses, and then wealthier people. Population is now 25% non-white, although increasing housing prices are beginning to force more economic homogeneity. So same story, the poorer people, the people of color being forced out for economic reasons. Oh, is that the same thing? Since the beginning of its renewal, inclusivity, so they're trying to include everybody in a strong sense of community, welcoming renters, homeowners, while the Inman Park Festival, which attracts tens of thousands of visitors, brings residents together to produce the largest all-volunteer festival in Georgia. So Inman Park, as an example of infill, of gentrification, of how places become more or less desirable over time within a city. Former industrial areas have been redeveloped into mixed use. So that's what I was talking about before, where you have, the former General Pipe and Foundry site is now North Highland Steel, and the Mead paper plant is now Inman Park Village. The early 1990s, the Atlanta Stove Works was transformed to the Atlanta Stage Works, a film and media production center that eventually housed the early Tyler Perry Film Studios, the National AIDS Quilt. So it's mixed-use office, residential. People are living there, people are working there, which is a really rad idea called transportation by proximity that we'll talk about next week. The economic model of gentrification. So this is an example of a neighborhood, and now there's yoga upstairs and loft apartments. So again, for boomers, that would be perfect. You can walk to late night entertainment. You can walk to a movie. You can walk. It's Sacramento. It would be living in downtown Sacramento if it was fixed up. The rent gap theory is the difference between what the rent that people are getting and they could be getting is. That makes sense? It's the gap between the rent that is being charged and the potential rent. And if they could get more rent as things gentrify, then they will. There's potential investment return. Often cities will have tax incentives to gentrify areas. Sometimes they'll do this by selling $1 homes. So you buy the home and the city is counting on the property tax revenue to be able to provide services to that neighborhood. Bed-Stuy in New York City. This is an example of gentrification. I would say, looking at these buildings, they look like they're in beautiful condition, but Bed-Stuy was the heart of the hood back in the day, and a very dangerous and not very pleasant place to be. But now that it's gentrified, it's pleasant. Los Angeles. Yeah, this is a great picture. So we've got these two guys. I have no idea what his deal is. It looks like he's using a walker and maybe has that baby carriage, but he's standing in front of a sign that's announcing gallery space available. So the neighborhood is changing. The neighborhood is getting ritzy. So people like this guy are probably going to be displaced. More Los Angeles. So we've got a quinceañera store right next to Cafe Vintage. That's a horrible name. With Evorp and Gaffles graffiti and an optometry and the quinceañera and tuxedo shop probably not making a lot of money as opposed to the expensive latte stuff. So it's the contrast between the yuppie cafe and the old neighborhood that's the primary tension in gentrification. It's the yuppies come to town, and now instead of menudo, you can get avocado toast. Boyle Heights, por ejemplo. So here we've got, I think, before and then after, and ironic. So we've got a bakery, and you can see that they've restored this. And up on the top, Above the gentrification, 1 Boyle Heights, 4 Boyle Heights, 4 Boyle Heights. So it's an anti-gentrification sign on a building that's been gentrified in Boyle Heights, which is a Hispanic neighborhood in Los Angeles. Also Boyle Heights. So this is an example. There's the new. Here's the old. Menudo. Sábado y Domingo. And here's the new. The East Side Love. Gentrification. Oh, transit-oriented development. So this week's lecture is going to be this lecture in the textbook. And next week, I really want to concentrate on more videos for you to watch and activities for you to do. One of the really cool things, I think, is transit-oriented development, which is when they redevelop areas or create housing that's close to public transportation. I think it's a fantastic idea. And new urbanism, we will explore through videos. New urbanism is the idea that cities in the United States can be redesigned. Existing cities can be made better. We can have livable, pleasant cities. And then, millennials and cars. If you live next to public transportation, if public transportation is accessible and convenient, then people use it. And millennials aren't into cars like previous generations were, which then makes these transit-oriented development, like these apartments that are close to rail stops and whatnot, those are going to be very, very attractive. One of the aspects of cities is homelessness. I mentioned the urban renewal projects that do away with the single residence occupancy hotels, the flop houses. Those people went someplace, they live on the streets. 500,000 across the U.S., about 40,000 in Los Angeles, and another 20,000 people that are on the edge of homelessness. Ronald Reagan is credited, blamed for beginning the homelessness epidemic in America, not just the result of the disastrous trickle-down economics, which cut tax rates, and then in order to balance the budget, they stopped spending money on social services for example, people in mental institutions, in public mental institutions. Many of those, as the result of Reagan and his policies, were just turned out onto the street. Many of the people who are homeless have substance abuse issues, physical and mental issues, and they need help. They need a place to live. So next week, I want to jump in and explore some of the stuff on homelessness, like Salt Lake City, their experiment with giving them homes. Turns out to be way cheaper just to give them tiny homes. Give them a place to sleep. Once you have an address, you can apply for a job. If you don't have an address, it's very hard to apply for a job. If you don't have any place to store your clothes, it's hard to get dressed to go to work. And in Salt Lake City, and there's also, I think, some other cities that have done similar programs, it turns out to be dramatic cost savings by spending money to care for the homelessness as if they were human beings deserving of mercy, as opposed to under the compassionate conservatism, it's their fault, they deserve it. So some of the features of the homeless landscape, the landscape of architecture of control. I followed a blog for a while that was just examples of things like this. By which I refer to as the architecture of control. Anti-sleeping benches. You can't have a bench that would allow people to sleep on it. You've got to put some sort of divider there. Otherwise, the poors will sleep there. This is impossible to read, but it's a list of rules and regulations at City Hall Park in downtown LA. No littering, no alcohol, no smoking, no blocking something, no damage to public property, no trespassing, no writing, printing, no advertising, on and on and on and on. In fact, this motorhome I think is perfect because one of the Best Picture nominees was Nomadland, about the experience in the United States of the boomer generation finding themselves economically unable to afford unable to afford a home, unable to afford housing. And part of the architecture of control is the architecture of the surveillance state, in which everything is on closed circuit TV. And so people are constantly being monitored for lifestyle offenses. Oh yeah, lifestyle offenses. Yeah, well, I'll have to talk about that next week too. Those are things like no sleeping outside, that making it actually illegal to sleep in public. Los Angeles homelessness, what do we say, 40,000, around 40,000. Here's a heat map of shelters and just a dot map of shelters concentrating on downtown Los Angeles and Skid Row. Skid Row. So Skid Row is the region of Los Angeles that has an exceptionally high concentration of homeless, single resident only hotels, the flop houses that I was talking about. So the issue with homeless shelters is that these hotels don't exist anymore. There are shelters, people don't want them in their town, and homeless dumping, that should be just one line, homeless dumping is when homeless people are picked up by the police and driven to the town next door and just kicked out the car. Yeah, we'll look at that next week too. I want to say it was Reno doing it. There was recently, in the last year, there was a case, an especially egregious case of homeless dumping. So cities are places, but when I say place, I mean place as in getting a sense of place, understanding the feel of the city and why the city has the character and the characteristics that it does. And the idea that there's three symbolic cities that everybody already knows in the United States. And those are the New England Village, the Main Street USA, and the California suburb. These sort of like archetypical cities that maybe don't really exist, but we all carry an image in our head from watching movies, watching television shows. Even if you haven't been to a New England Village, for example, Marblehead, Massachusetts. I grabbed this off of Google Earth. That's why some of the houses look wrinkly. But like, here's the church and the town square and these distinctive New England buildings. Main Street, USA. In fact, I did a double take on this. I don't remember what city this is, but I'll be jiggered if it doesn't look exactly like Disneyland. I mean, that's the whole point of Disneyland. Disneyland is supposed to look like small town USA around 1920. So, hey, good job. If I can't tell the difference between Disneyland and this town, it's a good example of Main Street, USA. Also, that earlier shot of Hazard, Kentucky, I think 1967, that's a good example of Main Street, USA. And then California suburbs with suburban sprawl. It's just suburbs as far as you can see. We've got some sort of commercial activity going on here. And yeah, this is Thousand Oaks. This is the town that I grew up in, which is indistinguishable from Santa Clarita, which is just around the corner. Six Flags is... Where did Six Flags go? I've lost it. But some of the features are obvious, like, retail. So this is probably the main street with retail, which will, yeah. Videos. I'll give you videos that will talk about what's wrong with suburbia, why it looks this way, how it got that way. The answer is racism. Oh, yeah. So I came across this. This is the Orange County, the OC. Here is the entrance gate to the OC. Here are some of the houses at the OC. More houses at the OC. More houses at the OC. More houses at the OC. There's a backyard with some vomiting frogs. And here's the prospective buyers, because this place is in China. They've actually started manufacturing in some parts of China, Southern California suburban neighborhoods. So Yeah, like this. They've got the classic California, and so I mentioned what's his face, Mike Davis. Mike Davis wrote a book, The Ecology of Fear. He wrote a book, The City of Quartz, about Los Angeles. And one of the things that he talks about in The City of Quartz about Los Angeles is how Los Angeles's suburban architectural decisions were partially driven by Hollywood. And the idea of how do you make a set look like a castle? For just for example, so in Hollywood, making movies, making sets, when they're making a set, they had to think about, well, how do you convey to somebody that we're in a castle when we only have the time and the budget to build a couple rooms? Yeah, we're not going to build an entire castle and just for this one movie. So they had to figure out how do you convey to the audience that this is a castle. So they identified the architectural elements, and then that's why we have things like this balcony. Like, it doesn't even look like you could open the door. Maybe the door opens in, otherwise you're not going to be able to water your plant. There's certainly no way you could actually use that balcony for like sitting. Maybe you could stand on it and shout at your neighbors, but balcony says luxury. Balcony says, oh, your house is fancy enough to have a balcony, but it's useless. Yeah, slightly larger balcony, but like what the... They've taken the worst aspects of Southern California suburban housing and recreated them in China. Yeah, another suburban area with the nice... This is how you know it's China. There's two cops and they're walking. Another view of the OC. Yeah. The Chinese flag. It's a clue. And then the street signs, Rive Gauche, which is in Paris. California Pont Neuf, which is in Paris. North Star Town Center. Yeah, and they also... Yeah, I can't tell which one this is. They also have recreated a fake British town and a fake like Swiss Alps town for people to live in. I think this is the fake town. They've recreated a fake Swiss mountain town for people to live there. I don't know why. Interesting. And then finally, the chapter concludes with a bunch of songs that I don't need you to listen to, but songs about cities, going back to the idea of a sense of place, that songs about cities. It's important to understand the meaning or sense of place that accompanies cities. Cities have symbolic meaning. Cities have sentimental meaning. Cities have meaning outside of just as a site where people live. They have meaning outside of that. And that's an important aspect of cities. I think that is, yes, indeed, the final slide. I hope you enjoy this week. I hope you enjoy next week as we explore urban geography.